Hi, and welcome to the Resilience Podcast. It's Brad Hook here, and today I'm pleased to welcome Tony Hansen. Tony leads the strategic direction and day-to-day operations of the Global Infrastructure Initiative, a community of the world's most senior leaders in infrastructure and capital projects. He has more than 25 years of experience designing and implementing complex global programs, working with corporations, governments, and NGOs across infrastructure, sustainability, conservation, and high-impact events. Tony co-created the Biodiversity and Wine Initiative, a sustainable agriculture partnership between the South African wine industry and the conservation sector, and is also on the advisory board of Tompkins Conservation. Tony also happens to be the brother of our founder, Dr. Sven, and I'm really pleased to welcome you here today. Thanks so much for joining.
Thanks very much for having me, Brett.
So, Tony, infrastructure and sustainability don't always go hand in hand, especially historically. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your interest in these areas and your journey that led you to where you are today.
Sure. So Brad, I guess it starts growing up in South Africa, and from birth, having family having just amazing exposure to extraordinary nature. So that was sort of such an important foundation for us, is getting out into nature, and our parents from the youngest age helped us foster that love, and it's continued throughout our lives. But with regard to the journey, from an education side, I did an undergrad and a postgrad in business, and also did a focus in IT systems during that postgrad phase. And then in my career, there've sort of been three big chapters. The first one was really running an international adventure sports company, running international adventure sports all over the world. It's because I wasn't ready to grow up and do anything else, and a great chapter, possibly my best. Is the dog. And then the next chapter was in sustainability consulting. I did 10 years of the adventure sport management, and then decided I really wanted to make a contribution to the natural environment, which I had a great passion for. It was an interesting journey to get into that. At that stage, if you didn't have a master's in environmental sciences, you weren't welcomed by the NGOs. I was fortunate that someone I knew at Conservation International threw me a bone and said, it looks like there's a huge threat and a huge opportunity to engage with the South African wine industry. Do you want to give that a try? So I took that on, and luckily it all worked out, and I can talk more about that later. But that was the beginning of a 10-year chapter in sustainability, and it started with the South African wine industry in a big sort of pioneering partnership of a whole agricultural industry and conservation. And then that continued when we moved to the US. I did a bunch of work with Walmart in really sort of leading their sustainability transformation, then worked with everyone from Patagonia to waste management, the Hollywood studios. Really had a really colorful and interesting time, and just quite early in the sustainability journey. So there was a lot of momentum, a lot of excitement, and working with some of the big players, was able to do some really exciting stuff. Then towards the end of that 10-year chapter, I was approached by McKinsey to ask if I could help them create this global community of infrastructure leaders, effectively create the Davos, or the World Economic Forum for infrastructure. Mm-hmm. The rationale behind that was infrastructure. We spend approximately $12 trillion a year on infrastructure. And that's, the definition is the built environment. So it's everything from energy systems to mining and materials, through to transport infrastructure, social infrastructure, and so on. And what the McKinsey researcher knows is there's this massive infrastructure gap between what exists and what you need for, at that stage, it was just economic growth, but stable economic growth. Now it's become sustainable economic growth. And that gap was increasing across the world and in most countries except for China and Singapore. So, how do we tackle this? Who do we need to get in the room to do this? So anyway, I helped them create the strategy of that, worked on that for a year and a half as a contractor, and they asked me to join it full time and really grow it into a year-round program. So that's the infrastructure stuff. And then throughout the journey of those 3 chapters, I've just purely through passion, I've done a lot of pro bono work with conservation in South Africa, in the US, in Latin America, in Australia, and a bunch of other places. And it's just always been pro bono. It's always been what I've loved doing. And I'm trying to find a creative way to make that my next chapter.
Amazing, amazing. And I mean, working with companies like Patagonia and seeing the evolution of that organization, that must have been really rewarding.
Yeah, and the really interesting thing there was the evolution from both parts of Walmart and Patagonia. And I'll tell a very brief story.
Please.
As part of this work that we used to do with Walmart, we'd run a quarterly milestone meeting, which is where we got the entire Walmart executive team and the leaders of all the different categories, and about 5,000 people would join it in person. And we'd orchestrate sort of an update on what was happening with sustainability. The leaders would talk about their commitment, and we'd bring in some guest speakers. And so we often had Hollywood stars and business people and NGOs and things like that. But I was designing this meeting, and I said, well, let's bring Yvon Chouinard. So we knew Yvon through the guy, through the company that I work with, and the founder is a very good friend of his. So we invited him. He said, yep, I'm in Jackson Hole, so if you want me to come, you've got to come and pick me up. So we arranged a Walmart plane to pick us up in California, go past Jackson Hole, pick up Yvon and Rick Ridgeway, his head of sustainability, and we went out there. And in the plane, I was talking to him, and I was saying, Yvon, this is a pretty conservative audience, so try not piss them off in the first 5 minutes. Try and just tell them the story, make them like you. And he kind of nodded anyway. He got up, and the first thing he said is, there's no point selling cheap shit. You're doing a disservice to your company, to your customers, and to the world. And I thought, oh, geez, here we go. Anyway, but he pulled it around and ended up getting a standing ovation. And after that, we took him to have a meeting with the chief merchant, and we started talking about doing a joint venture, and that evolved into something which is called the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, which all the leaders, both manufacturers and retailers of apparel in the world, about 80% of the total volume goes through this with a sustainability index. And it all started with that Walmart Patagonia connection. So it's always nice to see. And at the end of that first day, he said to me, Tony, I always thought business people were slime balls, and I never quite knew why I went into business, but I think this is the first time I really actually understand the impact that Patagonia can have on the broader business community. So, and then when you see his announcement just 2 days ago about sort of making the earth the shareholder, the only shareholder of Patagonia, it's just great to see the full circle.
We need role models like that, that's for sure. And even just on a personal level, using their products is such a pleasure. I've got a wetsuit made out of Ulex rubber from trees, and it's the best wetsuit I've ever had. You don't have to compromise on quality because it is sustainable and sustainably created. Yeah. Instead of a fortress conservation approach, which we've seen a lot of, especially in places like South Africa and around the world, that's the thinking was, okay, we want to preserve some nature, so let's build a big fence around it and keep the animals and the ecosystems in there, and we'll exist outside of here. Can humans, from your perspective, live sustainably, but maybe even regeneratively with our natural ecosystems? And what are your thoughts on some of the enablers of that, maybe decarbonization, and how can digital transformation help us? Any thoughts around that?
I certainly, I'm an optimist, and I believe absolutely. I think if you're going to take this approach, because there are many scientists will say that to enable to keep the world functioning and humans and other species being able to thrive in it, you've got to protect half of nature. That was what E.O. Wilson's perspective. That's a hard act to follow, but there is 50% of the planet which you could actually protect. the UN's actually following they're trying to get it passed this year in December to move it up from 17% to 30% of the planet that should be protected, both land and water systems and oceans. Now, if you are able to do that, I do believe that you can live in a regenerative world. Obviously, that's got to be coupled with decarbonization efforts. It's got to be coupled with sustainable production of materials and sustainable generation and use of energy and all those other systems. So it's absolutely doable on paper. I recall just recently on sort of a discussion on decarbonization and with a bunch of with McKinsey folks and scientists and business analysts, the thought that 90% of what we need, the technology we need to decarbonize is already in place. The challenge is we don't necessarily have the markets and the incentives to enable that and to enable people to adopt those new technologies. So it's interesting to see how close we are, but we just have to get the political, and I think it's going to have to be led by the political will, but obviously there also needs to be the business will and the general public will to do this. But incentives really make things go around. One other, just since you started on the concept of fortress conservation, and that's looking at sort of protected areas, and yeah, that's definitely, it served its purpose to a degree, but it's definitely flawed in many ways. The way things are moving, as far as I can see in conservation, is certainly the gold standard of protection is something like the national park. And if you're looking at the management of a national park, what you would aim to do is you'd have certain areas that are sort of no touch, no go zones. You'd have other areas which have light tourism, and then medium, and then sometimes even heavy. You take something like the Kruger National Park, for example, or the Yellowstone, or any of those big national parks. They have roads, they see millions of visitors going through, but that's only through a portion of the park. And there's obviously all the economic or socioeconomic benefits that come from that, because that can fund the conservation. And if there's time, if you want to go to it, I've got some really interesting example to share of some of the work that we did in Chile with the route of parks, but we can go there. But I do think the key thing is to make sure that you identify areas that you rigorously protect, identify some areas which have human use, and then obviously cities are areas with high intensity of use, but in some ways, done correctly, cities can have less environmental impact, negative impact, because you have such high density and people can live relatively sustainably versus, the sprawl of people living all over the planet.
Makes a lot of sense. I'd love to hear more about the work you did in Chile.
So I'll try and keep it the brief story. So
Sure.
This came about, and it's all through the sort of the Chouinard Tompkins connection. So if you don't know, Doug Tompkins was the guy that founded the North Face and then Esprit Clothing. He married Chris McDivitt, who had been the CEO of Patagonia for about 20 years. And both of them bailed out of very successful business careers and were disillusioned with business and felt that they wanted to take the money that they'd earned and the skills that they had to protect the natural environment. So they went down to Chile, an area which Doug loved and had done many trips to, and started buying large tracts of land. And effectively, they had a whole bunch of money, a couple $100 million from selling Esprit. They had a whole bunch of friends that put in money, and they almost cut Chile in half in the south of Chile. They bought so much land. It was severe, and at that stage, their model was just protected. There was a lot of pushback from Chileans, and their journey there it's been over 30 years. But their model evolved to, let's create national parks. Let's make sure that people benefit from these national parks. And I'd got to know each of them reasonably well, and Doug tragically died in 2015. And in 2016, Chris's wife had asked if Doug had sort of sketched out a plan for Chile, and that they were going to give back their two huge national parks with significant infrastructure to the Chilean government. So it's going to be the world's biggest donation ever of conservation land from the private individuals. And in return, what Doug had put on the table was that Chile would put in 10 million acres of new national park. And the vision was you would create this scenic byway of national parks from Puerto to Cape Horn, which is about, I think it's about 2,500 kilometers. And you'd have gateway cities, and the locals would benefit from it in a somewhat economically depressed part of Chile. So that was the vision. With his death, it had stalled. So Chris asked if we could come and help make the business case for that. So we were fortunate enough to do that and pitch it to the Chilean Senate. The deal went through, and then for the next year or two, worked on a plan to help financing that. So, you know, that's the route of parks. You can search it now on the internet, and you'll see it's just this amazing idea in these gateway cities that were starting. It certainly slowed down during COVID, but it's all starting up again now. And you know, it's such a good example of how humans can coexist with nature and benefit. And you know, and there are many other examples of what increasingly now are called nature-based solutions, where you have that, whether it be in fishing or forestry or tourism.
That's an amazing example. We'll definitely include a link in the show notes for anyone who's interested in finding out more. So when we think about climate change, for example, it can seem a little overwhelming, or for the plastic island that's floating in the Pacific Ocean, you know, it gives people anxiety. You hear about a lot of younger people experiencing extreme anxiety because of these changes that are taking place. Some of these challenges do seem overwhelming, whereas nature stewardship feels more actionable. And that's something that we're building into our model at the Resilience Institute. Do you think that conservation efforts, you know, hands-on awareness, are ways to reconnect people with the environment and start the process, you know, try and connect the dots between these big challenges and giving people actionable things that they can do?
Yeah, absolutely. I am such a believer, and I think it's a lot of the Resilience Institute work on that whole side of just getting outside and moving in nature. It is such a good way to recharge your system, recharge your energy, and be able to engage in the rest of life. So, you know, that is a very fundamental side. I think it's critical in all urban spaces to make sure that there's a way for people to reconnect with nature, whether it be a small park in the middle of a big city, or whether it be a national park in a sort of in a very rural part of a country. But that is absolutely key as a foundation point. You know, the other side that just makes me think in your question is there's that whole side of the benefits of generosity. And I think it's one of those underrated qualities and acts in humanity. And I think it doesn't really matter what the cause is. It could be conservation, it could be social, it could be other, but the pure act of giving, and I think when it's giving coupled by doing, it just does wonders for the human spirit. And if you are connected enough with it, you know, it's obviously fantastic when people donate money to a cause, but it's even more fulfilling when you donate money or time and energy to a cause which you are involved in, and you can see the impacts of that. And you know, I think with regard to resilience, that is such a key part of the puzzle. And sadly, it's one of those ones which sort of comes at the end of the line. And I think it'd be great for all of us if we could, you know, do some reprioritizing with regard to our work and all the other distractions we have in life, and put that closer to the front.
Yes, good point. I think connecting resilient people to resilient organizations and ultimately having a positive impact on our natural world if people adopt that mindset of generosity and realize the meaning that it provides, that sense of purpose that it provides when you are out in nature, even as simply as picking up rubbish or doing small things while you're enjoying being outdoors. It can certainly help create some momentum. And then I guess the other lens is, what can organizations do to contribute to us creating a more resilient, inclusive future? What do you think of initiatives like B Corp? We're becoming a B Corp at the Resilience Institute, which help us to consider all stakeholders, not just financial impact. What are your thoughts around those types of initiatives, and how can business be a force for good?
Well, I think, first, I think B Corp's a great certification. I think it's as good as we've got from the side of, how we connect business, people, and the environment. And, so I'm a strong supporter and delighted to hear that you guys are becoming a B Corp certified company. Business has a huge role to play. And I think there is definitely movement in the right direction. My one takeaway, I ran 2 sessions at COP26 in Glasgow last year. And my takeaway from that, and then just looking at a lot of the other analysis, is finally business gets it and is ready to commit. So I think that's hugely positive. And I think they get it because of the science. They recognize what it's going to do to their markets. I think they also get it because of the workforce, because increasingly people don't want to work for bad actors. And there's a lot more transparency now through social media and other things. So I think business is getting the motivation to move. And I think a lot of we've had a long period of greenwashing when it comes to the environment. I think more of that's being exposed and people are questioning it. And I think the puzzle to solve now is really to get the policy and regulations to help make a level playing field for the good and the bad actors, and that means the good will thrive and the bad will not. So if you take energy, for example, by leveling the playing field, which has been done in certain countries, what happens is initially through incentives, the price of that renewable energy comes down. The market then takes hold, and then if you look at solar, it competes with any source of energy at this stage. You still have the intermittency challenge, but it's competitive, and I think that is the coupling which for me is lacking. It seems like on the political side we've lost some momentum. There's sort of a short-termism perspective. I think there's a real fear of politicians that if they make the right long-term calls, it's going to cost their constituents more and they will be voted out of power. So I'm not sure how we overcome that conundrum, but I think increasing pressure from business will help. And then I think ultimately increasing pressure from the general public. I think collectively for all of us, it's very hard to change, whether that be driving our car less, flying on holiday more often, or business trips, buying stuff, stopping buying stuff in plastic containers, whatever, all of those things collectively help. And until we all change our patterns, the demand will still be there, and that'll be a signal to business and to politicians there's no need to change.
Yeah, great perspective on that. And I think that it does to some degree. It's not all down to individuals, but to some degree, it's the choices we make day to day that influence, where the demand is out there in the world. And if we are more, grateful, happy, positive, joyful in our day-to-day lives, perhaps we don't need as much of the things that are damaging to our environments and to the natural world. Yeah, it's an interesting exercise trying to connect resilient people, people who are calm, focused, connected to a resilient planet. And I think that's something that we'll get more clarity on over time. Yeah, appreciate it. What does it mean to be nature positive? This is something I read the term somewhere on a McKinsey paper, and I really like that idea that we can develop a mindset or a set of principles that put nature first, or at least at the top of mind when we make decisions, whether it's individually or collectively.
So I think the simple definition, and I'm not getting this from any source, but I've been using it, so I better have a rough understanding of what it is. Is that any entity through its activity, through its operations, or an activity has a net positive effect on nature. So in other words, it takes less out of nature than it gives back. So, you start thinking, I'm sure you've heard about this concept of regenerative supply chains, and so on. And so it's really looking at how do you do that. And Walmart's actually doing a really interesting exercise in their sustainability journey, where they've taken a number of their high environmentally impact products, and they're doing a real deep dive into how to make a regenerative supply chain, how to be nature positive. And it's a fascinating journey for them, because you've really got to look at a very deep level, beyond just carbon, which obviously is important, but also across all the impacts on the environment and people. And how do you shift these supply chains, which are often sort of 6, 7, 8 tiers down to the mines? How do you shift that? You've obviously got to have transparency for a start. You've got to have some kind of metrics. You've got to have some sort of offsets, because you're not going to be able to 100% remove the impacts. But ultimately, that's where the work is going. And we were doing some of this work with the various companies we worked with in 2008 onwards, but it's come a long way since then, just because of the transparency and the just general awareness of the impact we're having on the environment.
And a thought that just popped into my mind is, did COVID reveal fragility in supply chains, in global infrastructure? I mean, there was so much disruption. Planes stopped flying. People started working from home. Anything that springs to mind for you?
Yeah, it's really reordered, and there's a ton of McKinsey work if you're interested in, and I'm sure many others have written about it. But the whole term of economic resilience has changed. We used to buy from wherever we could, and sometimes we're 100% reliant, whether it be a company or a country, on sourcing certain goods from certain countries. And we had this complete open global economy with global supply chain. And COVID definitely helped us recognize that doesn't work. You can, example, there was in the US last year, we were trying to buy a car, and these cars were finished 99%, but there was one chip, and there was a shortage of the chips as a result of supply chain disruption, and so they couldn't complete and sell the cars. So what has happened as a result of that is most companies have rethought their supply chains from a resilience perspective, and they've tried to look at local sourcing, they've tried to look at multiple different suppliers. So there's a whole new approach to that, and I think that's really important. It's certainly from everything I read, we've got some severe economic turbulence ahead, let alone all the environmental and geopolitical turbulence. So I think it's really important for companies to really figure out resilient supply chains and rely on local too.
Yeah. Interesting. And I suppose that's the Tesla approach, is kind of try and build everything that you can so that you don't have to rely on external. I'm sure they do rely on a lot of external supply chains, but it's an interesting approach.
Yeah, vertical integration is definitely part of it. And I think the whole sourcing locally movement is another one. If you look at countries like the US, there was the US used to make almost everything in the US, and then it suddenly became a whole lot cheaper to outsource to China and other countries.
Yeah.
and then stopped making, outsourced all those jobs. And now a lot of it's coming back, and it's going to have to come back from a resilience perspective, because I don't think this is the end of turbulent supply chains.
Yeah, interesting. Anything practical that you can think of that each and every one of us can do on a day-to-day basis? For example, adopt new kinds of tourism, or voting for better infrastructure, voting for different political parties, organizational decision making. Any thoughts that practically we can take away?
I think the first thing is just to understand your footprint in the world, your and your family's footprint. Like, so just in going through the average day or average week, what do we do that has a footprint? And then, examine, question yourself, can we reduce that? So, it goes back to that whole thing of the size of our house, how we heat and cool it, the kind of car we drive, our travel requirements and how we do those, what we buy. So I think that's the first thing. It's just understanding your footprint and seeing ways you can lessen it.
Mm-hmm.
The next thing I would suggest is what's so important. I think it's what you guys do so well, is just make sure your personal resilience is there. So address all those things so that you can show up at work and across the board in a way that you can add as much value as possible. I think you sort of referred to parts of it, which maybe it came from that source. One of my favorite books that I read, and Tutu's favorite people. I met Desmond Tutu once, but not the Dalai Lama. But they wrote this book of joy when they were both around about 80. And as far as I recall, my takeaways from that, the three pillars of joy from these two men who just extraordinary global leaders who went through incredible hardship, but somehow managed to stay joyous, was really maintain a positive attitude, be grateful, and be generous. And I've got to say, my kind of mantra, whenever I'm not having a great day, I sort of examine those three things, and normally one of them's badly out of kilter. And so, that's I always find those as an adage, as a kind of my personal metrics and how the day is going. That's a very good one.
It is a very good one. Yeah, absolutely. Can you repeat it again for everyone, just so that they remember?
If you think just a simple thing: attitude, gratitude, and generosity.
Love it.
So just have your own measurement of those, and it'll probably tell you what kind of day you're having.
Absolutely. Any other books or films that you would recommend people watch or read?
Yeah, a few thoughts. A fun one, because he's kind of woven into a lot of the sort of stories and things I've referenced today, is Rick Ridgeway recently wrote a book called Life Lived Wild. So just to know who Rick is, he's a lifetime adventurer. He was the first American expedition to climb K2 and done amazing adventures all around the world, but he's also led all of Patagonia's environmental efforts. He is fundamental in all of the Tompkins work in the creation of the national parks, and just a great guy. But it's just one of the most fun adventure story books I've ever read. Other ones, the Book of Joy, as I mentioned, I loved. I thought Bill Gates's book on how to prevent a climate disaster was also very good, because it just really went into how the markets play in moving us forward to prevent both climate and biodiversity disaster. And recent movie or documentary series that I'm still watching is Obama did a great one on the national parks. I think it's on Netflix at the moment, and it's just the footage of those national parks around the world, it's unparalleled. They just continue to raise the bar of how they film wildlife.
It's incredible.
I just thought it was spectacular.
Yeah, I mean, the amount of time people must have to spend sitting in one spot to capture these moments, it blows my mind. I was in the dentist's office watching something about gorillas. And you just, I mean, I've spent time in nature wandering around in national parks. Yeah, it's very rare that you get to see these moments. So you realize how much time the videographers are spending just trying to capture these shots. It's incredible, right? Mm.
Yeah, absolutely amazing.
Yeah. Any final thoughts for anyone out there? First and foremost, I want to say thank you so much for your time, and thank you also for the work that you do. I think it's so important to have people like you being creative, looking for solutions, finding ways for humans to create a better future. The floor is yours. Any final thoughts?
Well, I'll borrow one from an interview I recently did with Chris Tompkins, and I think she might have even borrowed it from David Attenborough. But it's the time for inaction is past. I think for all of us, with whatever we care about, it's time to get out there and demonstrate our values through how we act. And I really think that's going to be the determining factor collectively as a species, if we can correct this, which is very correctable, or if we are going to continue going down the wrong journey.
It's definitely a message of hope. We have the technologies we need. It's just about starting the journey, taking action together.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Tony. It's been a real pleasure connecting. I'm sure we'll do it again at some point. I really appreciate your time.
Likewise. Thank you, Brad. It's been a pleasure.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone. Hope you enjoyed this episode of the Resilience Podcast, and I'll see you again next time. Check out the links in the show notes below.